After that, the meeting was inevitable. It was arranged in secrecy. Only a handful of advisors knew, and even fewer understood what was truly at stake. It was to be a discussion, not in London, not in Riyadh, not in Washington, but in a neutral location known only those invited, a place where belief could not become a spectacle. The king would meet the Grand Imam of Mecca. As the jet took off, Charles felt the same weight he had felt at her bedside. Her last moments were now tied to his next steps, and as they flew into the night sky, he closed his eyes and whispered again, not with fear, but this time he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to, because somewhere in the quiet of the aircraft, surrounded by advisors and diplomats, he could almost hear her final breath, and in that moment the prophecy wasn't a threat, it was a doorway that he was now stepping through. The desert air was still, the sky above was black, limitless, unbroken by clouds or stars. The arrival was discreet, no fanfare, no royal carriages, only quiet footsteps on ancient ground. And when Charles finally stood face to face with the Grand Imam, there was something in the silence between them, something more powerful than history. Two men, two belief systems, one planet. The Grand Imam spoke first. Peace be upon you, Your Majesty. And upon you, Charles replied, the words unsteady but honest. They did not sit in thrones. They sat on plain chairs. They did not speak of treaties or alliances. They spoke of people, of youth, of faith lost and faith found. They spoke of how belief in any form could be used for light or for destruction. Charles wasn't there to preach. He was there to listen, to understand the movement not through fear, not through news, but through human voice. And then the Grand Imam told him something he did not expect. We have heard her words. He said quietly, your mother, before she died. She warned you of us. That Charles' breath froze. How did he know? How could he possibly know? She was wise. The Imam continued, but even wisdom can be clouded by history. Know this, we do not seek to conquer, but we do not seek to be forgotten. There it was, the truth. Not aggression, not surrender, just existence. And in that moment, Charles understood his mother had not warned him of a battle. She had warned him of a choice. When he returned to Britain, he was different, not in his walk, not in his voice, but in his eyes. Something had settled, something no crown, no ceremony, no parliament could give him. The world had not changed overnight. Extremists still preached, politicians still lied, but something had shifted, a door had opened. He delivered a speech a month later, short and controlled. But in it, hidden inside royal language, was the truth of his journey. No faith is a threat when it is understood, and no kingdom is safe when it forgets how to listen. Some called it weakness, some called it bravery, but Charles knew, and somewhere beyond the veil, a mother was silent no more. He stood there in the dim, haunting glow of the bedside lamp, a son, a kin, and suddenly a keeper of something far beyond earthly power. The room was silent, but that silence was deceptive, thick with echoes of what had just been spoken, echoes he could not outrun. Charles didn't move when the nurse finally came in. He didn't look up, he didn't speak. He was still holding her hand, the hand of a monarch who had kept her silence even when the world was burning. But her last words to him were not silence. They were an unspoken burden, a warning buried like a prophecy. Beware the voice that speaks in peace but moves in power. He didn't sleep that night. He didn't even sit down. He stood in front of the window of Balmoral Castle, watching the sky slowly bleed from black to gray. Dawn was merciless. It lit the truth of her absence. King Charles III had been born, but not through trumpets or tradition. He had been crowned in the quiet horror of knowing the one person who understood the full weight of the crown had left behind a riddle. The funeral came. The world watched. The flags were lowered. And the mother became history. But the words did not become history. They became whispers in his mind. They grew into questions. Questions he could not ask in meetings or at state dinners. Questions that had no place in the official documents of a monarch. He attended ceremonies. He delivered speeches. He shook hands and nodded and bowed. But always, always the weight of that warning followed him, invisible yet undeniable. And then it began. It started small, headlines trickling into briefing papers. Not the usual political games or diplomatic disputes. Not the kind of scandals the royal family had been known to weather. Something deeper, something quieter. Across Europe, across the Middle East, across Africa and Asia, there were subtle shifts. Changes in language, changes in leadership, movements rising not with weapons, with belief. Meetings with intelligence chiefs became more frequent. Not about war, but about ideology. Charles listened, but he also remembered. Islam will rise in your reign, she had said. And now it was rising, not as an enemy, not as a rebellion, but as a question, a challenge, a presence. He knew Islam, at least academically. He had spoken of coexistence many times. But this was different. This was not the Islam of mosques and prayers. This was the Islam of politics, of influence, of the kind of soft power that moved in silence, in culture, in diplomacy. It was in early 2024 that the first letter arrived. It was from a leader in the Gulf, someone Charles had met before. Someone who had smiled and spoken of friendship and unity. It was respectful, polite. But beneath the surface, the message was unmistakable, a request for alliance, for representation, for recognition. Not just as a faith, but as a force. Charles read it, then read it again. He barely blinked. And then almost without thinking, he whispered her words under his breath. Not with fear, but with understanding. He didn't respond right away. He didn't rush. He watched the world's reaction, how different nations responded. Some bowed, some hesitated, and some resisted. When he finally brought the subject to the Prime Minister, the reaction was immediate. "We must tread carefully, sir." The PM had said, calm but concerned. This could fracture international relations. Charles didn't answer. He only looked out the window the same way he had on the night she died. And in that silence, he realized this wasn't political. It was ancestral, it was spiritual, it was the kind of test that couldn't be solved with protocols. He started visiting archives, old letters from kings long gone, diaries of monarchs who faced foreign beliefs. Nothing seemed relevant, nothing touched what he was facing now. Because the world had changed, technology had changed, people had changed, religion had not. Then one evening he returned to the room where she had died. It had been cleaned, restored, untouched since the funeral. And yet as he stood in the doorway, something in him shook, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was where it began. And this was where it would have to be understood. He walked slowly across the room, his fingertips brushing against the edge of the empty bed. He remembered the softness of her voice, the strange certainty she had in those final hours. And for the first time, he wondered, had she known more than she admitted? Had she seen something beyond death? That night, he ordered that the Quran be brought to his private study, not as a statement, not as a political gesture, but as a son trying to solve a riddle left by his mother. He read it slowly, not for faith, not for conversion, but for understanding, and with each page he began to see it. The reason she had warned him, this was not a religion of passivity. This was a religion of motion, of global unity, of deep and unbreakable ties. And in a world where faith was becoming fragile, Islam was not. Weeks passed and the pressure grew, media speculation, government tension, religious leaders murmuring in silence. The king had said nothing. And that silence was beginning to speak louder than any speech he could give. Then came the fire. It happened in London. A small mosque, centuries old, graffited and burned by extremists. The news spread like wildfire. Not just in Britain, but across the Muslim world, protests erupted in several cities. Reporters waited for the king's address, but Charles did not go to the press. He went to the ashes. The cameras watched as he stood there amongst the rubble, not as a king, but as a man. His face was unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft. Faith is not fire. Hate is, he said. And that was all. But the world heard it. They say the walls of Buckingham Palace have heard every confession, every secret, every doubt that has ever stained the royal bloodline. But there was one moment, one final whisper that lingered in the air long after the Queen herself was gone. It was in her final days, late September of 2022. The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp beside her bed. Casting long shadows on the royal drapes, Queen Elizabeth II, frail but still dignified, called for her eldest son, the man soon to be king. King Charles stood by her side, his face drawn with exhaustion, fear, and a heavy realization of what was to come. But what he didn't expect was the change in her voice, a change only a mother, heavy with history and prophecy, could deliver. "Charles," she whispered. And his name trembled in the stillness of the room. Her voice carried a weight he hadn't heard before, not in the coronation halls, not in the Cold War briefings, not even during Diana's death. She spoke of something he thought he'd never hear from her lips. "It is not the crown that will test you, it is the faith of others." But Charles leaned closer, confused, searching her eyes for clarity. Queen Elizabeth had been the defender of the faith of the Church of England for over 7 decades. Religion to her was clear, traditional, and unquestioned. But what she said next chilled him. "There will come a time," she continued, "when your throne will not be protected by tradition alone. You will be questioned not by Parliament, not by Britain, but by belief itself." Her breathing slowed, her fingertips cold against his hand. "Islam will rise in your reign. You must know how to face it, not with fear, but with understanding." Charles froze, this from his mother. The Queen, who never spoke of such matters beyond protocol, she went on, her eyes glassy, filled with an unsettling mix of love and warning. "I have seen it, Charles, not in reports or briefings, but in silence. In the turning of the world when I close my eyes, faiths are not enemies, but confusion, misjudgment, they create enemies from shadows." A long pause followed, the kind of pause heavy with centuries of monarchy, as though all history was pressing against them in that tiny room. Then came the final words, words that would never be recorded in any royal archive. "Beware the voice that speaks in peace but moves in power." She held his hand a moment longer. And just like that, the monarch who'd reigned over one of history's most tumultuous periods was gone, leaving behind a warning that haunt King Charles not in politics, not in pageantry, but in faith. He stood there long after her eyes had closed, feeling the crown's shadow growing larger, darker. The palace felt colder than ever. Outside, the world mourned. But deep within the monarchy, an old world had ended, and a new unpredictable one had begun. Some say those words were the last true prophecy of the House of Windsor. Others say it was just a mother's final test.